Welcome to. I am Christopher Roper Schell, your moderator. I am contributing editor at Fair Observer and a partner at Fair Observer Intelligence. My guests today are Rajeev, Mantri, and Harsh Gupta. And here you're going to have to help me, Madhusudan. Rajeev is an India-based entrepreneur and investor who invests in both public companies and early-stage technology ventures. He has contributed 1 million articles on political economy, technology, investing, and entrepreneurship. He graduated with a BS and an MBA from Columbia, specializing in private equity and value investing. He is on Twitter at @Mantri. Harsh is a Mumbai-based investor and entrepreneur. He has written on economics, finance, politics. Co-authored 2 books, the one we're going to discuss today, and another book called Derivatives. He's working on his 3rd book now. Harsh is an IIT Delhi dropout who did his graduate from Dartmouth and INSEAD. He is a CF Bain and Company, a whole bunch of other places. He co-founded an educational nonprofit for underprivileged girls, and he is at Harsh Madhusudan. I butchered that, but we'll get through it. So with these 2 budding intellects, we approach the 75th anniversary of India's independence on the 15th of this month. So we're going to delve into a really well-written, well-reviewed book called A New Idea of India. Before those of you watching, press the red subscribe button and follow us on social media. So with that, Rajeev and Harsh, welcome. I really enjoyed reading this book. Rajeev and I met in California a few months ago, and when he gave me a copy, it's more of a scholarly work than the sort of lay of the land book du jour. It was very impressive, and I was also surprised with this depth of knowledge, how accessible and readable the book was, even to someone like me who is frankly not as familiar. So it was a crash course on the state of politics and society in India, and told me what the future holds potentially for India. With that, I want to open with a question about the title. You guys offer a new idea. You also mentioned that is intentional to say a new idea, but this title clearly implies a modification or alteration of an older idea. So what is the old and what is the new?
Yeah. No, I was saying thank you, Christopher, and thank you to Atul for inviting us to Fair Observer to discuss the book and some of the themes that we talk about. I think these are very relevant for the new order that is unfolding in the world. And both Harsh and I are delighted to be on your platform. So to just jump into the title of the book, you are right. It is kind of a suggestion that this new idea breaks from the old idea. In a broad sense, the old idea of India, if you want to call it that, stood for 3 things. One was sort of, a sense of non-alignment or kind of staying loosely within the, on paper, non-alignment, but kind of staying loosely within the communist bloc, being a sort of left-oriented country through most of the 20th century. The second plank was that's in foreign policy. The second plank was adopting a more socialistic model or almost a communist approach in domestic economic policy. And the third plank of the old idea was placing a primacy on group rights rather than individual rights in the area of like social policy. So the Indian state actually evolved in a way after independence where individuals would be seen as members of groups and not as individuals. So it was always about which caste you belong to or which religion you are from the eyes of the state. The distinction that we make in the book, since you read it thoroughly, you would have noticed that the distinction matters in the realm of policy making. Because what happens is when the state differentiates between groups in that manner, ultimately it ends up picking winners and losers. That the state becomes, especially when it is combined with the socialistic model, then the state kind of picks winners and losers and says that okay, this group will get this and that group should get that, and so on and so forth, which tends to amplify fissures in society, which tends to create frictions and instead of papering over those frictions or healing those frictions, we end up multiplying them. So I would say these would be the three main planks of the old idea, and our new idea suggests a kind of breakage from that old idea by embracing a strong sort of national interest oriented view when it comes to foreign policy, individual rights when it comes to social policy, and a kind of a liberal economy, free market approach when it comes to domestic sort of policy in the realm of the economy. Harsh, anything to add to that?
No, that's great.
Yeah, there is an underlying sort of live and let live and faith in markets and individual freedom with the understanding of an important role for the rule of law. A lot of ways that these programs have segmented society. As an American, this seems natural, but am I correct in feeling that you're fighting a slightly uphill battle, either by virtue of politics, history, or all?
So first of all, I think the voice is getting a bit cracked. So pardon me if I did not get the entire question right. But I think I got the gist of it. That basically, are we fighting uphill battle in terms of politics, history, by emphasizing individual rights, rule of law? What to you sounds very kind of intrinsically or inherently American. So I think that's what we actually kind of delve into the first chapter a lot, right? I mean, the subtitle, which we've not discussed so far, is Individual Rights in a Civilizational State. And the reason that is interesting, or at least was interesting to us, was that the individual rights part is often seen as smaller, liberal, capital W, Western, etc., or in this present sense, left liberal or at most classical liberal. Whereas the civilizational rights, civilizational state is seen in the Indian context as Hindutva, or some kind of, in some people's minds, right wing, etc. So there is a certain sense of contradiction, or in some people's mind, an oxymoron to the fact that this kind of liberal republic could coexist with a Hindu, Indian, dharmic, civilizational state. And what we try to do in the very first chapter is to try to show why that is completely a false distinction. And we begin at the very roots of Indian civilization, which is the Rig Veda. And we quote from the Rig Veda, pontificating or speculating about who created the universe. And the Rig Veda goes on to say, maybe the gods know, or maybe the gods don't know even, because the universe is basically before them. And we kind of emphasize the inherent skepticism in many Indian philosophies, which is different from atheism or nihilism or cynicism. That inherent question of questioning attitude. And there is a lot of kind of false Eurocentric narrative about Indian philosophy being very religious, whereas European Greek philosophy being very kind of quote unquote rational. And there is a lot of retrospective, kind of anachronistic shadowing from the present to 2,500, 3,000 years ago. In a lot of Greek philosophers would also often pray to the gods before going on to doing what we now consider to be capital R rational. And the same thing with the Vedic corpus, which is at the fountain of Indian civilization. There is this inherent flexibility. So we basically say that this kind of civilizational narrative goes very well, for example, with the market economy, because the market economy inherently assumes that we do not understand everything what would be required, right? There is, if you understand everything about what is required, the socialist model appeals to you much more. But if you believe that there is a certain skepticism at play here, or should be at play here, there should be some epistemic humility, then you would rather go with this kind of organic, Hayekian, catalactic kind of model, right? So there we draw the analogies between this, as you said, live and let live, but not just in a sense of tolerance, but in a sense of mutual respect. And that is at the core of dharma in a very broad sense, which is more than religion.
And you talk about tolerance and intolerance, the degree to those who are intolerant.
Yeah, so for example, we quoted Karl Popper's famous paradox of intolerance, and we kind of put that in the Indian dharmic kind of context. saying obviously that the root of the dharmic metaphysics, if you will, is that there is mutual respect and not just tolerance. But of course, that breaks down, that harmony of fraternity breaks down if it is not reciprocated, and which goes along with this kind of Popper's tolerance of paradox of intolerance, where if you tolerate the intolerant too much, too far, they end up destroying the people who were actually asking for tolerance and more. And so that is very much at the root of what we discuss, because there are, for example, Karl Popper wrote in his Open Society and Enemies about Plato, about Marx, about Hegel. But for example, he did not cover Islam and Christianity, which have been, as far as non-Christians and Muslims are concerned, like Hindus, pagans, etc., a very expansionist, imperialist ideologies. And so we basically end up saying that, listen, if you want that to be in the same framework, we need to have some open conversations about how this works out. So Rajeev, do you want to add something to that?
No, so actually the question which you raised, Christopher, on these ideas sounding Western, one of the tenets of the book is that these actually are not just Western. In fact, they are a core part of the dharmic philosophical ethos of the country, and there is no contradiction between individual rights, be it in the economy or in society, and India's ethos, India's civilizational historical ethos. And this is one of the criticisms of those who oppose reforms in various ways in India. Whether it's on the the Marxist sort of grouping on the left, who ironically, obviously Karl Marx was not Indian, right? But they frequently will criticize market ideas as alien ideas. In the same way, those who are protectionist or those who are not pro-market, they too will say, these are imported Western ideas. So I think it's important to understand, actually, and that's one of the main takeaways of the book, I would say, that individual rights are in consonance with India's philosophical ethos. So that's one of the main takeaways that we had in the book.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about consistency of individual rights, how some groups are advantaged, how in some respects Hindus may have fewer rights than their Christian and Muslim peers, which came off as almost a bit of Hindu self-loathing, or not self-loathing, but deprecation and disadvantage that comes through the advantages given or created for minorities. So rather than having a system that is one of perhaps some more difficult, more infighting within the unified country India seeks to create. Going a touch into that, I found it interesting the way you guys talked about secularism and how those two have been kind of turned on their heads and what they mean within the context of Indian policy discussions and politics. I'm interested in how these terms became muddled and the problems that had been created.
So I'll go for that. So basically, I think what happened was just like the term liberal, small L liberal, got involuted in the West, right? You went from classical liberalism to left liberalism today. You went from John Rawls talking about individuals to present day wokeism being all about tribal identities. So that shift happened within 40 years. Similarly, in India, there was kind of this notional attachment to secularism, but we never ended up defining that in the constitution, actually. Ironically, the time when the word secular was inserted in the constitution was during a 2-year dictatorship called the internal emergency. Until then, it was all vague. We never got to the French definition or the American definition or a consistent Indian definition. So it was very much a modus vivendi, which kind of retrospectively got sanctified into kind of this state ideology that nobody can question. And as you rightly mentioned, these minorities, especially, for example, in the Constituent Assembly of India, allowed proselytizing. But there are effectively free speech restrictions. So it's difficult, for example, to criticize Islam or Christianity, forget the violence, etc., just on the state policy angle. But they, for example, are free to convert Hindus. It's not symmetrical. Similarly, on educational institutions, they get quotas and affirmative actions. Whereas even non-taxpayer funded Hindu institutions have to face regulations that taxpayer funded non-Hindu institutions do not. So it is actually very telling in the sense, because this kind of Hindu cohesion itself is relatively new in a political sense, is very much a product of modernity itself. So that's what Rajeev and I found very interesting. Rajeev, do you want to add something to that?
No, so yeah, so it's this policy of kind of selective discrimination, and saying that if the policy goes like, you show me your group identity and I'll show you the policy. There's no consistency in this, in that the same citizen who's from group X, there's a different rule, and from who's from some other group has a different rule. This applies in civil laws. This applies in areas like educational institutions. So there was literally a clamor by, when some of these rules were tightened for the quote unquote majority owned or majority run institutions, there was a clamor to bring in, let's say, minority partners into those institutions to kind of change their nature so that they can get a minority tag and escape the regulatory intrusion of government. So it has resulted in some almost comical cases where even a prominent sort of Hindu movement went to court saying that we are not Hindu because they didn't want the intrusive influence of government into their institutions. So it's and why does the government do this? I think the reason is straightforward. It is well known in India that this is a practice of vote bank politics. On the one hand, the state wants to coddle certain orthodox elements, certain conservative elements. On the other hand, it wants to almost guilt trip. They are guilt tripping a large section of Hindu society into thinking that it's almost like you are the big brother, so be magnanimous, be generous. So what?
And in stressing the necessity of ending the Nehruvian idea of different rules for different religious groups beyond Nehru, writing, and I'm quoting, "The electoral forces of demand and supply cannot possibly remain in imbalance for too long." What makes you think this is coming?
So it takes essentially, if you're a sharp enough political observer or a political practitioner, and you are looking at this situation, it's only a matter of time before somebody figures out, wait, there's something off. Why is this happening? And then enough people start questioning these practices, and then there is a counter pushback, and that's what we are seeing now. People are speaking up. People are sort of discussing these issues and asking why. Why should a prominent Christian-run missionary institution in New Delhi receive 95% of its funding from the government and have explicit quotas, and in fact even lower admission standards, explicit admission standards based on religion, and then it should be publicly funded? Why? So people are questioning all of this now.
Yeah, in your book you said Modi convened a group, a council of sorts, and they found that 50% went to 1% of disadvantaged people, and you can put that better than I will in the context of India. And I found that interesting, that there's seemingly more data driving the impetus for change. Do you think data and really understanding the problem and presenting it will help move these policies and progress them?
So I think
Harsh, this is about the Rohini committee. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. So I think what you're referring to is, this one is more on caste-based affirmative action, and so there, the political nuance is a bit different. For example, Rajeev and I, we write in the book, caste is a bit like race, right? I mean, we want all group-based identities to go, but you have to differentiate conceptually caste and religion, in the sense that by definition you cannot change your caste on paper. You can change your religion very much legally. So what you're saying is about a very small section of ostensibly disadvantaged communities and castes getting the lion's share of the affirmative action benefits. That is very much correct. The Rohini committee that Rajeev referred to. There is a bit of a question mark. The reason why more data and census is not aggressively done here is the institutional memory of British colonialism, whereby there is a sense that documenting with finer granularity the castes and subcastes of India is a two-way sword, in the sense it might give you better analytics for better targeting. It further ends up dividing society. So very much the Hindu consolidationists, let us put that way, or the political Hindus are in two minds about documenting in too great a detail, which they think social forces are gradually withering away. So I hope you understand the trade-off there of you want to target it better, but if you really start counting it very well too soon, it might lead to its own dynamic. So that's the kind of stalemate we are on the caste affirmative action side.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the politics in pursuing these policies, you say that politics is a zero-sum game, and go on to write, and I quote, "Economic intercourse, individual freedoms untethered to the government should be a cornerstone of the economy moving forward, leading essentially to what we might say a bigger pie." But you also talk about this non-zero-sum game of economic intercourse, the way you break through some of that media bias, the way you break through some of these historical narratives and beliefs.
So essentially, I think if you look at it as a virtuous cycle, so on the one hand, economic freedom would enable kind of more individual sort of self-expression, self-actualization. People need not be tied to whatever vocation they were, their parents were doing, or that their community was born into. So that aspect of social mobility that economic freedom enables is actually very critical for the larger kind of nation building project that India is sort of undertaking. And on the counter side, there's the kind of this one is the virtuous cycle. The vicious cycle that we've been trapped in, that we argue since independence, is that we had a combination of socialism or near almost communist economics with the standard tropes like the government controls the means of production, everything was heavily licensed. So India had this for the better part of 50 years after independence, and along with that there was a system of the government deciding who gets what in terms of these group-based allocations of resources. So we are breaking away from that old vicious cycle and trying to get into the new virtuous cycle where sort of economic abundance, sort of prosperity can unlock the energies of the population and allow each individual, each Indian, to self-express and self-actualize what they want to do with their time, with their lives, and not be tied to the bonds of the past in terms of their kind of prospective view of the future.
Mm-hmm. So you have a whole chapter called "Profit is not a dirty word." Flipkart was one of the turning points in the acceptance of entrepreneurship. Is something like Flipkart the kind of tangible proof of the good of competitive markets, and will that within India and steer the future of the Indian economy away from some of these governmental policies toward freer markets and less government intervention?
Yeah, so I think the startup ecosystem is absolutely revolutionary in the Indian context, not just for the obvious technology and economic reasons, but as Rajeev hinted, right? I mean, the very fact that anybody—
social transformation, yeah.
The social transformation, that anybody could start a business irrespective of the community or caste they are from, is by itself a revolution. Secondly, access to capital. So it's not just caste, community, it's also class. People who are born in the low middle class, but just manage to somehow get a very good education, are today on equal terms with people born in very rich families, with probably much less drive to actually suddenly go and create the Flipkarts of the world, because technology allows that leapfrogging, right? So you went from really small mom and pop stores to e-commerce. You also have some Walmart kind of stores, but that's kind of just by the way. That's happening in sector after sector. So you went from snail mail to self-help. You kind of, India, for example, almost leapfrogged the landline concept, right? So same on the internet. Most people directly went to the internet on their phones and not even a laptop, forget a PC or an equivalent Mac. So on all these sectors, suddenly 1 billion plus people, all of them having their version of India's version of social security. So they have phones, they have no frills, very cheap bank accounts, including almost all adult women now, even if the balances are low. And they have a bank account, they have a social security ID equivalent, what's known as Aadhaar, and they have a basic cell phone. Suddenly you can sell across India. Like you could be a housewife taking care of 2 kids, but in the part-time you could be writing books and selling it from Mumbai to the northeast of India, to Kashmir, to the south, deep south, whatever. And that, just imagine millions of people doing it on a small scale or doing it on a very transformative Flipkart kind of scale. And this is just starting. And India has the world's cheapest cell phone and broadband data. The quality may not always be very good, but it's rapidly changing. And as we speak in this month, 5G is being launched by the 2 largest carriers. So that is the context in which this technology entrepreneurship is happening. And all the new talent, except for 1 or 2 states, are increasingly more focused on this job. Like a very small thing I'll add quickly before I hand it over to Rajeev is again, on the social side, if you were saying you're a startup person, it's so difficult for you to convince your girlfriend's father to allow for you to get married to your girlfriend, for example. It went from being considered extremely risky to something that is now aspirational. So there are a million revolutions happening within the last 10 years. It's only getting faster and faster.
No, that's absolutely right, and I think it's something which I see on a regular basis in my professional life, and I've kind of seen the whole curve now over the last decade, how these things have evolved. So whether it was in the book, we specifically write about 2 events. One was obviously the Flipkart acquisition, which not only in a way validated the potential of the Indian market, but also created enormous wealth. So the founders of Flipkart, the early employees, all of them were able to kind of encash their equity holdings, and these are all people in their 30s, 40s, and so on. So they have a long sort of business career and sort of professional life ahead of them, and they've already created significant wealth. On the kind of wealth that would be created in decades in India, they managed to create that in just about 5 or 8 years. So it's a real transformation. I mean, these kind of things never happened in India before. So that was, I think, a big one. And the other one was the legitimacy given to this kind of startup ecosystem and asset class by the renowned industrialist Ratan Tata. So when Mr. Tata retired from chairing the Tata Group in 2012, he quickly turned to angel investing and venture investing, much to the surprise of the surprise of the larger sort of business community in some ways. But I think given his stature, and that he chose to do that, I think made many people in the older generation feel that this is something legitimate.
Yeah.
So they would not view that activity as something for real, or like it was almost a dismissive kind of tone that people had towards it. Oh, this is just whatever. Who cares? It doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. It doesn't matter for Indian business. But when a person like him decided to sort of pursue it and put down his own capital, put his reputation behind some of the companies, I think it really changed something in people's minds.
Yeah. I want to talk about a social argument for entrepreneurship and competitive markets. And you very compellingly point out that it reduces social discrimination. In fact, the worst end, the worst end of the deal, if they discriminate. Uh, so I think that social element was interesting. And do you think that also finds resonance within India and makes entrepreneurship all the more appealing?
Yes,
Okay.
for example, you're absolutely right, Chris. There, we quote from Gary Becker and all the standard Chicago economists on that, and we use examples and references from Indian literature. So, for example, if you send resumes to a multinational Indian IT technology services firm, it's one of those double-blind experiments. It does not matter if you're Hindu or Muslim, etc., etc. But obviously, when it becomes more and more informal and smaller, because again, historically, trading and business and entrepreneurship was restricted to, a few communities. And we have to remember, when you do not have the state capacity, you do not have the judiciary, and to a large extent, we still don't have a efficient or fast judiciary, but at least we have a judiciary and a better judiciary. The only deterrence to cheating by a business partner was kind of naming and shaming him in social intercourse. That was an incentive for you to keep that kind of trading circle or business circle quiet and small and narrow. But the moment you become more formalized, and India is rapidly formalizing, again, the startup revolution is one aspect of that. People who are relatively strangers who would otherwise not do so much social intercourse can become business partners or affiliates. So that also brings much more legitimacy. For example, the one of the key founders of Infosys, Narayan Murthy, very respected in India for the corporate governance, etc. Um, so he and people like Ratan Tata, who Rajeev quoted, are seen as role models in India, right? People are not begrudging their wealth. People understand that there are some kind of crony capitalists actually, and people who cheat and do the frauds, but there is much more nuance now in the public discourse that this is fairly earned wealth. This was through cheating and corruption. They need to
No,
go
and
to
certain business leaders have created good jobs.
a lot of jobs.
They have created wealth. Small shareholders have benefited by owning the shares of these publicly traded companies. So all of that.
That virtuous cycle which Rajeev was talking about, like hundreds of thousands of jobs have been created by just one company, for example, the Tata Consultancy Services. And there's a lot of attrition. So just imagine millions, tens of millions of people through the private sector, not through the government jobs, have gone from low middle class to middle class and much more aspirational. Their kids can have the best education. The middle class in that very Indian sense, but also a very American sense, a reference that you would get. We quote Andy Warhol and other people in the book saying, the moment you start having a Coca-Cola, right, it's the same Coca-Cola that the president has, that a Hollywood star has. It's a state of mind. The Indian middle class numerically might be actually in the higher percentiles, right? It might be 80 to 95 percentile, may not actually be 50 percentile. The people who call themselves middle class technically are probably upper middle class in India, right? It's still a relatively per capita poor country. But the moment you enter that mind share, it's also a social class, not just an economic class. And that sense of egalitarianism and social mobility is completely different from the old sense of a very static quasi-feudal lifestyle. So it's a revolution in that sense as well.
And it's interesting, the markets in the economy and entrepreneurship, or various sects or groups, be they religious or otherwise. In fact, you quote Ayn Rand, who says or writes, the smallest those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be defenders of minorities. So I think that is an interesting argument, so that it becomes instantly palatable and appealing. Now I want to move on. You talked briefly earlier about the spend a lot of time inefficiently, and this may be true of other parts of the bureaucracy. I want to talk about some of these reforms that you discuss, and you talk about educational reform, judicial reform, bureaucratic reform, and how do you see them getting implemented?
So in some sense, if you see what was happening in the country after independence, obviously, like we discussed, India took kind of the socialistic path. India decided to the government decided to take up all kinds of business activities, and linked with that, once you go down, it's the kind of thing where if you speak one lie, you have to speak another 50 lies to cover up the first lie. So once India decided that it will be a kind of public sector led economy, then you needed a cadre of managers, technologists, engineers to support that public sector, which is why India had to create the IIMs and IITs, the renowned management and engineering schools. Now, often, when I kind of critique this decision, obviously it's controversial because these are very beloved institutions in India. But from a public policy choice perspective, did India need to spend public money building up a business school in the 1950s or 60s? And similarly, should we have invested in the primary education system, or should we have invested in engineering colleges? My view is primary education should have been prioritized, which was not. And for a long time, India was essentially subsidizing premium tier kind of higher education, but neglecting primary education. Now, for a resource poor, kind of fund constrained country, that's a disastrous choice. That worked to the benefit of many Western countries, including the United States. You would have the best talent in the country receive a subsidized education, and many of them would simply move west after that. In that sense, on the educational side, we made that error. Then on the bureaucratic side, again, having IAS officers, the government civil service officers running companies, engaging in policy making to a very deep degree, and controlling even the prices of commodities. So that only was a recipe for a huge amount of corruption, and associated with that was black money. So then there's black money generation going on. So then to curb that, you do another set of disastrous policies which came in the 1970s and 80s. And I mean, we can spend the entire day actually talking about this, but it was just a series of disasters, and nobody said that wait, let's go back and question the initial decision itself of going for a kind of highly planned and socialist economy. Only under kind of immense pressure, when India was essentially kind of becoming insolvent, much like some of our neighboring countries are today, in 1991, that India started reforming. India gave up that license Raj. India started dismantling that kind of highly controlled economy. And then obviously in the last 30 years, the results are very obvious as to why India has been growing. But to sort of go back to your question on how some of these reforms will happen, I think people are now realizing, the Indian people are realizing that what is what. So I mean, we should remember that for hundreds of years, this is a society that has been kind of oppressed, that has forgotten what prosperity is, that can't imagine itself, that rather couldn't imagine itself becoming prosperous. So any government had to come along and convince them that this can actually happen. I mean, this was true in the 1950s, this was true in the 1980s, because even by then, for centuries, India had not been succeeding. At least even kind of igniting that belief in the future that this can indeed happen. It's taken a lot of kind of the proof in the pudding, so to say, as Harsh was pointing out, successes like the IT industry, other kinds of industries which have grown in India, mostly in the service sector, but even in manufacturing. So now that people have seen what can happen with 25-30 years of mostly sustained liberalization, they are seeing the case for it, that let's try this. We tried all of that other stuff, it failed, so let's restructure, reorient our economy, reorient the government. And while there are always pockets of discontent, pockets of obviously pushback from special interests, but by and large, I mean, the fact that I think at this point it is also kind of well established. Like if you study elections and who's getting re-elected, who's not getting re-elected over the last 20 years, it's pretty well established that governments who are delivering, who are reforming, who are changing sort of the way things have been done in India, they are the ones who are coming back into office. And in that sense, India has also been fortunate to have been blessed with leaders like the current Prime Minister, certain chief ministers who have kept on the reform path in spite of many obstacles and many kind of pushes and disruptions from the entrenched groups who are trying to stop this progress in the country.
I like that. It's an interesting phrase. Indians have forgotten what it's like. Your book makes a compelling argument as to how to remind them of. We've talked a little bit about reforms. A reform that's interesting to me is for civil service workers, and that sometimes leads people to their ability. Would you recommend a segmentation or variety, creating or placing civil service employees?
So in India, what happened was we kind of inherited this system of the bureaucracy from the British, and the British modified themselves, but we kind of forgot to modify ourselves. So that's the colonial thinking, right? When the colonial rulers leave away, but you're suffering from civilizational PTSD, that you just take some time to gather the self-confidence and think on your own. It's in a larger time frame. I suppose we shouldn't be too harsh. That's just how it is. So that's exactly what you're saying is right. That, for example, in the US, the legislature and the executive are actually separate, and it's only in the top people, the secretary of this, the secretary of that, what in India are called ministers, and below that they have kind of specialized bureaucracies. In India, we have what Rajeev briefly mentioned, IAS, the Indian Administrative Service. Under the British, it was called ICS. It's very generalist. So we have other branches. We do have, revenue and forest, but the most prestigious and broad one is the Indian Administrative Service. And while it's a bit of an exaggeration or a caricature, but you could find the same guy working on agriculture this year, then on railways or some other completely different field the next year, and then working on water preservation 2 years down the line. And remember, these people's salaries don't go up or down. I mean, they just only go up in metronomic regularity, but there is no incentive. If you perform well,
and also they are the senior most decision makers. They
wield
a lot of influence.
A lot of influence, a lot of resources at their command, and they don't get fired, right? I mean, so you have no carrot, you have no stick, and you have no deep expertise because you got to wing it. If you're actually managing 4 different departments in 4 different years, again, a bit of an exaggeration, but it has happened and continues to happen, then what happens is, you're actually insecure about actual subject matter experts. Speaking of reform, there has been some lateral entry. So like a dozen or so people who are not career bureaucrats have entered from the private sector and have been staffed in different departments. That experiment is largely positive, but very much a work in progress. Anecdotally, we hear them facing a lot of roadblocks, but somehow they've managed to embed themselves in the system. And this could only be expanded dramatically. So again, very, very classic public sector union problems. Rajeev mentioned education, for example. So private sector teachers get paid much less, but actually perform better, often despite less credentials. And in the US, on the so-called right wing, you have the school choice movement. India is a bit too premature, but the same problems are there. It's just incentives. And how do we get around that is a work in progress.
Well, and the stakes are high because you have diplomats who maybe don't want to be diplomats. You have IFS and intelligence who may not be suited to that job. Yeah. And so you're communicating with foreign governments, and I'm not knocking anybody here, it's just an example, using people who may not want to be there or might be better at something else. So the results and the outcome are massive. are macro, and it runs the risk of people and governments speaking past each other, or perhaps not understanding one another or articulating their position as best they could. So it can lead to a fundamental breakdown in geopolitical relationships. Now, the main problem, of course, is that if you have people in jobs where they're not suited or don't want to be there, you have a disincentivized civil service class. So I would presume that a lot of changes, or you would prescribe a lot of changes to the way the civil service operates for the betterment of India. I also want to talk about what you guys do. Everybody's got a million degrees except me, and you have written tons of articles. Rajeev and I had many, many good conversations when we were out in California. What is it you're doing, and how does that benefit India and move forward? Because I have a feeling it dovetails nicely with a lot of what you write about in the book. There it is. And what are your goals as entrepreneurs and financiers?
Rajeev, should I go? Okay, so I'll go first. So basically, I'm very much a public markets investor who moonlights as a writer. So this is, as mentioned, I had written a book earlier on derivatives. That's more like a textbook on finance, a particular vertical within that. I'm right now writing a book called Long India. So that's, why should you be bullish on the, next 20, 30 years of the Indian growth story from a macro investing and economic kind of perspective. So a bit more econ heavy. This one was more like political economy and the broader social context. I think we are, Rajeev will obviously speak for himself, but we have very similar backgrounds in the sense that, of course, wealth creation is good. And we want to give back in some ways, not just necessarily in terms of money, but in terms of ideas, create institutions, think tanks. So Rajeev and I, we have co-founded something called India Enterprise Council, which is very much in the early stages, and Rajeev is leading it. Again, just about writing papers and just getting some good ideas about very specific topics and circulating that both amongst the people as well as the policymakers. That's one way to give back. And I think we're also very, very, very passionate about the India growth story in the sense how it actually impacts the people on the ground. For example, I mentioned about the nonprofit I had started earlier called Gyanada. So that's, again, very hands-off. It's a group of people are leading it very well, and I co-founded it, but they're basically teaching coding to girls here in Mumbai. So the aspirations and the can-do spirit amongst some of the most economically underprivileged people in India, but that just general sense of positivity is amazing. And I think it's, I've always noticed among some friends and foreigners and expats who come to India, they're like, well, why are they not more morose? And they're not depressed. They're very positive about the future. And I think that this just being, there is an element of, we were talking about narcissism off camera, right? Off record. There's a sense of anthropomorphizing our own stories with the India story. It's very fascinating how, like, we're kind of, of course, India is an ancient civilization, but a very young nation, as you write in the book, and how that grows out, and how it's just a crazy adventure and journey, and with a very good end, because India's final growth should also help all of humanity, right? There has to be a larger message of pluralism and kind of spiritual, polycentric kind of things, other bunch of things that Rajeev and I are passionate about, which go beyond just money. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so at a personal and professional level, so my focus in the last decade or so has been, so I kind of stumbled into writing, to be honest. I was never really thought of myself as a writer, but it's just something I picked up when I was in university in the US. And it was a nice kind of side gig sort of when I was studying, and kind of that having that, brand name of having written for Forbes and so on when I returned to India, it certainly did help me. Because otherwise, I don't think anyone in the Indian media ecosystem would have taken a 23-year-old seriously if I didn't have that Hobbes thing on my CV. The writing bit started there, and even again my exposure to the US kind of tech and VC ecosystem, back in the day, that sort of kind of really oriented me in what I want to do in my professional life. So when I returned to India after my studies, I kind of saw a gap in the venture ecosystem where there were some early stage kind of investors, but not too many in the kind of what's nowadays called the deep technology, frontier technology category. So essentially, my thesis was that India has a lot of technical talent, and there is a case for doing like science-driven innovation from here, both driven by India's commercial commercial and economic needs, as well as the opportunity to sort of build here, sell everywhere. Build in India and go international when it comes to finding customers and finding opportunities like that. So that's what I've kind of focused on. And you're right, Christopher does kind of sync pretty nicely with the overall India story. And in addition to that, both Harsh and I are very interested in doing like more policy focused like research work. We feel that many of the ideas that come obviously to us don't seem so obvious to even thinking people who are reading newspapers and books and so on. So I think that argument needs to be made better in the public domain, and that kind of research-driven, data-driven case needs to be made in a better manner in the public domain. So we are working on a number of projects like that. I think we are both sort of very bullish on India for the next decade or two at least.
Yeah, and both of you, this is profoundly well researched. I don't know when you guys sleep, honestly. You talk just briefly as we close about why you're bullish on India. I mean, the book presents a number of problems. It also presents solutions conveniently. I used to work with a girl and she'd say you're either a problem identifier or a problem solver, and most people are problem identifiers. But you both are very optimistic.
No, so in a larger sense, if you look at the set of problems, before India, most of these problems are not, rocket science. They already have solutions. Like we all sort of, most of us who are in the sort of looking at policy making and understanding the kind of economic and political economy issues that are prevailing, everyone knows the solution to most of these problems. Some of these problems require unique kind of approaches given the size and scale of the country. But I would think many of these issues before India have already been solved. So the question is actually one of leadership. India needs sort of leadership, at the union government level, in the states. We need people who are committed to actually the progress of the country. So I think if we have that, then there's no doubt that we will fulfill our economic potential. And sometimes you only need good government for a decade or two, and then even if some incompetent person comes along, they can ride the momentum, and the country is already on its way. So that's why I have no doubt that somebody of great incompetence will sooner or later run India. But I think by that point, hopefully we would have achieved kind of escape velocity, and the costs and consequences of incompetence will not be so widely felt, if I can put it that way. So I mean, Harsh can, I think, talk about more in terms of per capita where we are and where we are going. But that's why I feel confident in it. I think we have good leadership in place. We have fortunately, and obviously the leadership is in place today because people seem to be understanding that this is what we need and this is who we need to do it. So in various states, in New Delhi, we have good leaders, fortunately, for now at least. and hopefully these leaders will be able to take India into a orbit where it will acquire some serious globally sort of impactful heft and relevance.
I'll just briefly add to that by saying, see, India is the world's largest democracy by far. I mean, it's 4 times the US population. Next year, it overtakes China's population as per the latest estimates, right? I mean, and for most of history, economies were proportional to populations, right? In the last 200, 300 years, it kind of changed. The big question in global macro is, are we living in an age of economic convergence or divergence? I broadly feel we're living in an age of convergence. And in 30, 40 years, people will again say, well, it is obvious that the world's largest countries with the largest economies, right? So let's not go into the technical details here, but broadly, the question then that will be asked is, why was India the world's largest political unit? And I think that's where you have to go back to the civilizational wisdom of India, right? The fact that it could incorporate so much diversity. I mean, there is geography, there is history, there's all of that. The fact that it could get so many people to live together, I think that's what's so unique about India, and that's what it has to teach the rest of the world. And that is in a way the substrate, the structure on which everything else is formed, right? Because the beauty of the world's largest democracy is you have scale in a world that is not necessarily deglobalizing, but is definitely changing the form of globalization, where scale matters. You just can't be a small economy and prospered like you used to earlier for some decades. And secondly, you have the scale, but you still you have the scale, but you still understand what is it that needs to be done. So you have some internal coherence. That is what's not there in other large parts of the world. For example, the African unification project will take some time. The Latin American unification project will take some time. Middle East is a mess. And there are underlying reasons for that. So why is India being able to be one nation that is actually a continental-sized civilization? And then on the basis of that, you kind of do the leapfrogging. So I think that is a very interesting aspect it's understandable why it's not so discussed right now, because you just see a $3.5 trillion economy, and therefore it is not seen as very attractive or, quite frankly, threatening by many people. But that will change rapidly in the next 10, 20 years. And we'll see many more India experts and quasi-experts and fake experts and pundits, because India is the next big story. Make no mistake about that. Anybody who has anything to do with geoeconomics, politics, investing can only afford to ignore the India story at their own peril.
And you do talk early on in the book and throughout about this convergence, about democracy within India, bringing people together, even in areas where it seems unlikely. You talk about majority-minority communities and how India is able to pull everything together in the direction it's moving. And with that, I want to thank y'all. It's been great talking to you, and I really appreciate it. For those who are watching, follow these guys. I know Rajeev said this book isn't rocket science, but Harsh has a good movie recommendation for you out there right now if you do like rocket science. But follow them. Please follow us at Fair Observer. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you to Fair Observer for having us.
So,